Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about the Brandon Sanderson, Sanderson-Keehe Crisis. All right, let's get into this. All right, so yesterday, Brandon Sanderson. Who is Brandon Sanderson? He is a much beloved, massively successful American science fiction and fantasy writer, right? And he had a dust up with Sanderson-Keehe. Who is Sanderson-Keehe? He is a San Francisco a successful San Francisco magazine writer who was invited, who went to do a piece who traveled from San Francisco to Salt Lake City, Utah, San Francisco, California, on the coast. Coastal elitism is part of here, and then also and he went to Salt Lake City. That's the heartland. That's the heartland of America. Okay, so he goes to Salt Lake City. He is invited into Brandon Sanderson home, and he stays for days to write a story about Brandon Sanderson that will go in Wired magazine. Okay, which, by the way, magazines are really no longer a thing at all. Like print magazine, like there's just a few print magazines that are still being printed, just really out of an American nostalgia journey. No need for them at all to be printed. But Wired is both a digital and a physical print book, print magazine. It was physical for many years. I think it's still physically printed, which is interesting. Tell me if I'm wrong there. And so, what was the crisis? What was it? So essentially, Sanderson-Keehe wrote an article about Brandon Sanderson, and it was put into Wired, which is not a small platform. It is a massive platform. Then, and basically what he said was that, paraphrasing here, link below, you can read it for yourself. And actually, I'm going to link to a video, right, that talks about this. And so most of the videos and this blew up on YouTube, and like tons of people came out and did takedown pieces of the article Sanderson-Keehe wrote, right? So what did they say, right? Good question. What did these articles say? So here's what they said. They said that here's what the YouTube videos covering Sanderson-Keehe's article said. Said it was targeted, said it was personal, said it was specifically written to make Brandon Sanderson sound sinister, right? And Sanderson-Keehe flat out said that that Brandon Sanderson is lame. It was incredibly targeted. It was incredibly personal. It was incredibly mean-spirited. That was another word that was used in multiple videos, right? So you're like, well, why is this a crisis? It is definitely a crisis, and I'll tell you why. This article is so bad, right, that it makes us look at American society in a deep light. So this article is a layered pancake of prejudice. Sanderson-Keehe establishes himself as a villain, in my humble opinion, in this article, saying, I definitely came to do, and this is very interesting, and this is the part why we're talking about it in context of Dungeons and Dragons, right? He came to do non-physical harm, right? So non-physical harm, and so Sanderson-Keehe, and so what are the prejudice? So let's establish the villainy here, okay? In my humble opinion, so one, this is massive cultural prejudice, right? So I'm a coastal elite. You're a repugnant heartland troglodyte, right? And this isn't a joke. Sanderson-Keehe in the thing says, the day I arrived, I realized I was out of San Francisco. And then he goes on, and you're like, each day he has to keep himself from crying because he's no longer in San Francisco where he can get great dim sum. Now he's in Salt Lake City where the dim sum is subpar. And this brings Sanderson-Keehe to the point of tears, right? He has to hold himself back from crying. He's being hosted in a millionaire's mansion right? Being given a special suite, being taken out to dinner virtually every single night, being like assisted by Brandon Sanderson's family and friends and workers, being treated as an honored guest, and this brings him to tears. This brings him every day to the verge of tears, and then at the end of the article, he says he does break down in tears in front of Brandon Sanderson, and you're like, oh my gosh, what did Brandon Sanderson do to Jason-Keehe to make him cry? He turned on The Greatest Showman, and Jason-Keehe had to watch Hugh Jackman sing. Blink, blink. Like, okay. The most repugnant, layered, cultural prejudice, right? Just massive prejudice, right? Saying, I'm a coastal elite, and I had to bring myself to this dirt pile in Salt Lake, and I had to endure living with a heartland American, right? Like, how am I even going to get good Asian food, right? And I'm from the coast where we are elite, right? I'm not going to stay here in this dirt farmer scrubland, right? Like, first of all, I've been to Salt Lake City, Utah. It is gorgeous. It's unbelievable. It's a cultural center, right? It's absolutely stunning. The layer of prejudice is so thick, like you couldn't cut it with a knife, right? Like, it's incredibly thick. Next, this isn't a joke. Jason-Keehe calls Brandon Sanderson a weirdo Mormon. Massive religious prejudice, right? Agnostic, I'm guessing. Maybe it's atheist, right? He's a coastal elite from San Francisco. Come on. Like, right? So he's like, hey, I don't believe in God. This guy's a weirdo Mormon, right? That is completely inappropriate, right? You cannot, like, call people names based on their religion. That's outrageous. And I don't care how much of a coastal elite you are, that's just repugnant and horrible, right? And villainous, in my humble opinion. The last one is Jason-Keehe, right, is upper middle class, right? But Brandon Sanderson is a tens of millions millionaire, a full-on legit millionaire. Not like, oh, I got 2-3 million in the bank, right? But a full-on legit millionaire, right? Like tens of millions in the bank. He just broke the record for Kickstarter and had a $40 million Kickstarter, right? So he is a legit full-on millionaire, right? And so, and Jason-Keehe just like lambastes him from top to bottom, saying, how dare you have money, right? Like, I'm upper middle class, you're wealth class, massive prejudice, right? And so where we land with and here's the last part that is a crisis, right? So this is Wired magazine, right? And they printed this article, right? And they printed a shocking fact about their own staff, right? So Jason-Keehe went into the Wired offices and he was assigned this story, and he talked to the people in Wired, and no one knew who Brandon Sanderson was. What now? Right? So that means that no one in the Wired offices, or the vast majority of people in the offices, have never read Mistborn, have never read The Wheel of Time, have never read, the Stormlight Chronicles. I think that's the new one, Way of Kings, and right. These are massive, hugely popular fantasy. Not only had they not read any of his books, they're so dyed-in-the-wool literature people that they've never deigned to go, like, to get this deep and to have never heard of Brandon Sanderson. You'd have to be exactly what happened in the 60s and the 70s. Oh, I don't go into the gutter of sci-fi and fantasy. I read literature, right? I don't go into that gutter area, right? It's just the absolute. So not only is this, so the reason this came out from Wired is there's cultural prejudice, there is religious prejudice, there is wealth prejudice, and there is fantasy prejudice, right? There is reading prejudice, right? Like you'd have to be deep in the weeds to have an office where no one had ever even, it's totally okay. Like, if you didn't read him, I get it. But you've never even heard of him, right? That means you've never read sci-fi or fantasy in the last 20 years, because Brandon Sanderson is all over it, right? And so you have a group of writers, right, who have never heard of Brandon. That is a crisis. That is a crisis. That means these coastal elites are so hate-filled, right, that they don't even deign to read anything that a commoner would read. I'm a commoner, right? I've read Brandon Sanderson's books, right? I've read Stormlight Chronicles. I've read Mistborn. I've read The Wheel of Time. And my favorite is, he's got a short story about it, A Cloned Admiral. I've read it like 15 years ago. And I should look it up, but it's really fantastic. It's my favorite book he ever wrote, right? It's actually a novella. He is amazing, right? But this means the coastal elites are so prejudiced, they won't even entertain looking at any books that commoners, and this prejudice is eking out, right, from the coast, from both sides, and is washing like the heartland in massive, horrible prejudice, right? We talk about marginalized groups. Brandon Sanderson is fully marginalized by the West Coast and the East Coast, right? This is a coastal elite versus heartland problem, right? So where does this become useful for Dungeons & Dragons? Here you go, okay? The monster manual is filled with combat villains, okay? So basically, the skeleton, right? And the red dragon. These are combat villains. We don't know what an interaction villain looks like, and we also don't know what an exploration villain looks like. That's never been addressed in Dungeons & Dragons. We don't have a model for it, right? But I think we can start to build a new monster manual with interaction villains, and they would be templated off of this human villain, Sanderson-Keehe, right? He is the perfect example of an interaction villain. Comes in, sweeps in with a dark cape into a space and just sprays prejudice and absolute hatred at one particular person. Does zero physical harm, but absolutely is harming this person and just layering them with so many layers of prejudice that it's hard to even keep track of them all, right? This is an interaction villain. So now we have a template, and we can start the second monster manual. First monster manual is filled with combat villains. The second monster manual can be started, and we can have our first IRL template for a Dungeons & Dragons monster, an interaction monster, and Sanderson-Keehe is the model. He is the worst interaction villain I have ever seen in IRL. He is an IRL interaction villain. What he did to Brandon Sanderson was fully repugnant, unexcusable, and absolutely horrific, and points to a massive problem of a new marginalized group, right? The heartland peoples. West Coast, East Coast, hatred coming in from both sides. It is a crisis, right? What we do with it as Dungeon Masters is we recognize the first interaction villain template, and we build interaction villains with the same heartless cruelty, the same virtual fangs, the same virtual claws that Sanderson-Keehe has exhibited. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.